But ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for me to introduce our keynote speaker. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Tasneem Chopra, who is a cross-cultural consultant and board director. Tasneem was named one of 16 women to watch in 2016 by Latte magazine. And in previous years, she's been listed in the Age magazine's top 100 most influential movers and shakers in Melbourne, and the Australian magazine's top 10 thinkers. Through her consultancy, Tasneem speaks to issues of cultural competence, identity, leadership, and intersectional discrimination across the private and the public sector. When not delivering keynotes like today, or workshops, or emceeing events, she's a board director for Ambulance Victoria and chairs both Lentil as Anything, which is a great venue, I've been there, and the Australian Women's Centre for Human Rights. She's also a senior curator at the Islamic Museum of Australia. A TEDx Melbourne presenter and writer, Tasneem's latest paper was the Griffith Journal for Law and Human Dignities, Burqas, Bombs and Bogeymen, highlighting media bias against Australian Muslims. She has a master's in international development, a background in psychology, and has worked in community development and politics for 2 decades. Tasneem has appeared in numerous editorial outlets, including The Guardian, The Age, and The Australian, and features as a commentator on Q&A, The Drum, The Project, and National Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tasneem Chopra.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me at the back? Yes? Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, weather notwithstanding. And I was told not to mention, is it the football, the rugby? But just note the colours. There's some simpatico going out there to you all. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon where we've gathered here today, and in particular pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. This land always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to thank the organisers at Multicultural Queensland for this invitation, for bringing in a foreigner, so to speak, to your event. I don't take that invitation lightly. I'm extremely honoured to be here to share my insights, but also learn from yours. And to that I want to acknowledge also my co-panellists, of course, Mr. Hinchcliffe, the many ambassadors of Multicultural Queensland, which is a new thing I didn't know about until recently, so that's fantastic. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. So this topic of leading inclusion and being part of the charter of conversations that you're having, I think is very promising in and of itself, because you're talking about situating progress according to the way that people are included as you progress leadership, as you progress conversation, as you progress planning. That's very important. But if we take that back a little bit, I want to start with a tweet. Speaking of tweets, Peter, I once tweeted something along the vein of multicultural people have long coveted a seat at the table which society expects them only to set and usually make the food for. But in knowing that and experiencing that myself, I'm now all about disrupting the status quo and, proverbially lifting the tablecloth off that table and either just taking a seat myself or starting my own table if I feel the existing one isn't keeping up with the world that we live in. So I want to talk about the things we hardly ever talk about. I want to talk about the dearth of cultural diversity in leadership and management generally in this country, and why it requires analysis and why it matters. My participation here comes from the perspective of a public service consumer, a citizen advocate of well-being, if you will, and the issues that intersect with that particular union. My approach will be something left of centre, speaking to grassroots observations and anecdotal references of myself and my colleagues, and how I have determined an intersectionality of class, culture, gender and well-being, and how these play into the way we relate to each other, and how we negotiate difference, and how this difference, more often than not, manifests itself not enough in leadership. My context is relevant as an Australian context because that is my forte. As a first-generation migrant who arrived here as a child, whose sense of self and well-being is countered with notions of gender, race, ethnicity, and in all my years in this nation. And it's the experiences that I've observed that have broadened my worldview of how who we are informs how we are. To put it another way, our self-perceptions are informed by our view of our place in society. And so for whatever value that might add to the conversation charter, I see this moment as my opportunity to share, both the personal and the practical. To start from the start, I want to talk about the first time in my memory that I recall being made to feel different and the impact that it had on me metaphorically and how that impact has shaped a lot of the decisions that I've made. Now, I apologise to some of you who attended the Queensland Police Iftar because it's the same memory, but it bears repeating. So I grew up in country Victoria in Bendigo. It's a little town in the centre of Victoria. Last century, let's just say. And at the age of 7, I recall very clearly, at the end of my street, there was a playground that I'd go to after school. And in the centre of the playground, there was a corkscrew slide, the twisty slide. And all the kids knew the rule of the slide, which was to wait for the person ahead of you to go down before you followed. Generally speaking, there was never an issue with the rule, until one fine day, I approached the slide and a boy came from behind, took over and went up ahead of me. I knew this guy. He was always there. He had red hair and freckles. His name was Ewan. It's a very Bendigo name from the 70s. And Ewan, he shot up to the top and he sat there. I slowly ascended the rails and he was still sitting there. And he sat there. And I waited for this male to stop blocking my progress. But that's a whole other paper. And ultimately, I could see the blood in his neck running up. He was really holding back. He had something to say. And then he turned around and he literally exploded with his expression and said to me, I was 7, he said, "Why are you brown?" Now, I was 7, but I was also a middle child. And if any of you have been a middle child or have a middle child, you know we have a response for anything. And so I mustered all the 7-year-old wit that I could in that moment, and I looked him square in the eye and I said, "Because you and God put me in the toaster and you missed out." And then I shoved him out of the way and I went down the slide. And it felt wonderful. I broke the rule. I gave him I had the last word and he didn't have a comeback. But as I came down that slide and I had that aha moment, while it felt victorious, it also felt heavy. And that heaviness of that reaction is something that I have experienced innumerable times when I've accosted Ewans at school, at uni, in the workplace, in government, in media. They've all been there. I have come across a swathe of them. And in those instances, or with most of them, I've succeeded in holding my own, even though the Ewans have now morphed into the United Patriot Fronts of the world, or the Breitbarts, or indeed certain leaders of the free world. The point is, where I have struggled and gained lessons in endurance from a lifetime of dealing with obstacles, this has taught me skills and provided me platforms today that I don't take for granted. In staying this course, my work has availed me to some fierce and fabulous role models, like Ken Lay, who's the former Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, like Tim Supfamasan, the current Race Discrimination Commissioner, Moira Kelly, founder of Children's First Foundation, and Rosie Batty. So each of these people have in their own way championed causes from education, anti-discrimination, equality, or ending violence against women. They've unwittingly spurred me on to make a noise, to make it loud, and each in their own way have demonstrated and taught me the nuance needed in my capacity as an activist, as a feminist, and as a diverse leader, and as an Australian. Today, among the many hats or turbans that I wear, which include author, curator and cross-cultural consultant and board director, I discuss racism, identity and belonging. The requirement to speak authentically is crucial. I don't fit a stereotype, and why should I? I am a whole lot of parts. I am Kenyan-born, of Indian origin, Bendigo raised, coffee drinking, chocolate hoarding, book loving, turban donning, feminist leaning, tax paying, exhausted activist. And I won't compromise on any of those labels. And why should I? I believe in challenging people's assumptions about me and countering them with actual engagement. And to be clear, I don't seek confrontation, but nor do I tolerate intolerance. It's not as if I can check in 3 of my labels at the door and just bring the rest to the table. I am coloured, I am female, and I have a head covering. And the associated baggage that comes with that is not something that I should be required to assist others negotiate due to the discomfort of their racism. That's not how this works. And this is the point, that race and religion and gender and other identity categories are often treated in mainstream liberal discourse as launchpads of bias in which social power works to exclude or marginalise those who are different. My experience is that there is still limited scope for diversity to be incorporated into mainstream conversation planning because systems and people who govern those systems just aren't ready to be that inclusive ever, because their understanding of the other, when our dimensions deviate from the norm, locates us as an exceptional, curious tick box entity. To be honest, to state that that's mildly irritating is an understatement, and that may not be popular, but that's the point that I get to make as a citizen, a taxpayer, a consumer, and a disruptor. To challenge comfortable conventions and call out the awkward and unfair when I see it. It is only in disrupting the long-established systems of privilege that change will then start. Experience has taught me privilege is largely invisible to those who have it, and often the people most uncomfortable with discussing racism and change are those with racist attitudes. My mantra has always been to own your narrative before someone else owns it for you. For there are few things more frustrating as a person of colour in this climate to be constantly spoken about but not spoken to be constantly decided about but excluded from the decision-making processes. So now I'm all about embracing and taking platforms, grabbing chairs on tables and opportunities which I can then advocate for change as issues impact Australia's diverse communities. With this in mind, I know that I have a responsibility to pay it forward in the spheres that I influence. While those of you with privilege and knowledge in your spheres, you also have a duty to do the same. Paying it forward matters. Hence, when an opportunity to apply for a board role with Ambulance Victoria and the Australian Centre for the Moving Image and Luke Batty Foundation and now Australia presented themselves, I saw them as opportunities critical for me to walk my talk, to occupy a space not traditionally representative of culturally diverse mindsets, with a view to represent that voice and cohort, with an intention to promote broader social inclusive practices as normalised across the organisations and also impact internal and external work practices towards a more socially inclusive framework. And I have no doubt that the decision to appoint me on some of those boards with my background was done in recognition of, yes, my professional capacity with a background in sociology and psychology and community development, but as well because of the currency that I bring to the table in representing culturally diverse communities. Sadly, impacts and agents of change at this level are few and far between across many board-making and decision-making platforms. In 2016, the Diversity Council of Australia reported, among other things, that ostracising, scapegoating and discrimination were at record highs in social and professional spaces, and the isolating effects on the psyche of a community were palpable, and remain so. A recent survey by SBS and Western Sydney University uncovered that 80% of 6,000 respondents agreed we have a racism problem in this country. And within that cohort, up to 30% experienced discrimination in educational settings. And for those who spoke language other than English, it was 54%. Discrimination experience in service usage was also high, following a report from the Council showing an overrepresentation of culturally diverse users permeating into employment and even public transport access. To this I say, let us just be enriched by our difference and not feel threatened or paralysed, or worse, ambivalent to it. To attract diversity, you need to model it. It's that simple. We learn from that media adage of you can't be what you can't see. As we progress from the theoretical to the practical, ask yourself, how has diversity in leadership manifested across your organisation? When middle and senior management themselves remain outside of the progressive meld of diverse talent that makes up your institution, where is the organisational will to commit to progress that is meaningful and literally across the board? When you create an industry that is reflective of who you are as a community, that matters, because inclusivity is a very real sign of listening and implementing social change towards a growth trajectory of an organisation in a globalised world. This is the face of Australia as it evolves. Perspectives through lenses of gender, culture, religious and linguistic variance are perspectives which enrich the mindset and growth of an organisation. In fact, in explaining why embracing diversity matters, I wanted to quote Azmina Hussain, who is a lawyer with Maurice Blackburn. And I'm going to read a statement she made on diversity in the legal profession, but it has a lot of applicability beyond. She wrote, "We understand that we must be accessible to all Australians and ensure that the most vulnerable members of our community have an equal platform to be heard and contribute, regardless of their religion, cultural background, age, gender, disability or sexual orientation. As a starting point, as a profession, we must ensure that we reflect the diversity and are attuned to the values and representation that make up our society. Put simply, our workplaces need to look like and represent our culturally and gender-balanced community." End quote. This concept speaks to the necessity of diversity representing not simply a bottom-line presence of your clients and your constituents and your users, but in an across-the-board presence from top down. A piecemeal recognition only undermines a sincere approach, opposed to a meaningful will to effect cultural change that is acknowledging and embedding of culture. In terms of how to make a change at this level, it's important to understand what implicit bias is as well. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding and actions and decisions in an unconscious manner. And there are certain characteristics of unconscious bias. They're pervasive. Everyone has them. Even people who are avowed to impartiality can hold those biases. We tend to hold biases that favour our own in-group. That's human nature. But they're malleable. And it is possible to unlearn or apply de-biasing techniques to particular schemas and ways of thinking that we always hold. I want to share a little story about a woman in Melbourne. She's a young engineer and she talks about the impact of implicit bias on her experience, and it's very telling. "I work in a male-dominated industry with limited youth representation. As a female of colour, and I wear a headscarf. I thought about my career trajectory and the opportunities that have come to me, and the idea of serendipity playing a role in my career path is an alien concept. For me, opportunities did not necessarily come knocking at my door. I worked hard to submit numerous job applications, made countless phone calls, and attempted to find common ground with people at failed networking events. Despite consistent failures, I persevered and eventually scored myself some job offers. The pride was short-lived. When sharing my excitement with male counterparts, they snubbed off these accomplishments, claiming my employability was based primarily on companies making a tick in their diversity and inclusion quotas. In a society where I know I am being paid less than my equally capable male colleagues, I have to work significantly harder to prove my worth You will find me working longer hours, putting up my hand to do things nobody's prepared to do, and stepping out of my naturally safe zone as an introvert just to get my voice and opinions heard. The more we alienate minorities in the workforce, the less likely they are to progress beyond junior roles in this business. It's not just about ticking a box and putting those who represent the minority on an equal playing field. It's about nurturing and supporting their careers. The lack of diversity in industry, the lack of representation and systematic inequality in salaries, these are battles we should have resolved well before the 21st century. This is Nada, and she's like 23. So, in addressing the case for change, I know you've heard from Dr. Tim Thomasan last year, but he's made some very pertinent comments to this issue. He said that if you want to see what Australia's multicultural success looks like, check out a high school prize night in any major city. Chances are you'll see the children of migrants often dominating. Last month, research from the Organisation of Economic Co-op and Development, OECD, they showed that the children of migrants from India, Philippines and China were outperforming their Australian-born classmates by significant margins. What happens, though, to these high-performing children of multicultural Australia? Do they graduate into success stories in our universities and in our workplaces? What kind of professional future are they likely to enjoy in our business, government and other institutions? We are yet to see these trends remotely mirror workplace ratios within the leadership of our organisations. Now, based on the 2016 data, nationally we have 58% of Australians who have an Anglo-Celtic background, 18% have a European background, 21% have a non-European background, and 3% have an Indigenous background. And from the data that the Minister just shared with us, I read that 2 in 5 Queenslanders are either born overseas or have a parent born overseas. So diversity is there. It is present. But how are we responding to it? This is who we are, but it's not being manifest across all tiers of society and industry, and we need to ask ourselves why. An Australian Human Rights Commission report of almost 2,500 senior leaders in business, politics and government showed that there was only very limited cultural diversity in those numbers. Almost 95% of senior leaders at the CEO or C-level suites had an Anglo-Celtic or European background. Of the 372 chief executives and equivalents, 97%. Of the 30 members of the federal ministry, there's no one who has a non-European background and only one with an Indigenous. And within the public service, where 99% of the heads of federal and state government departments are Anglo-Celtic, the statistics are consistent. In applying a gendered lens to the same, only 2.5% of board members at the top 200 publicly listed companies are culturally diverse women, and with only 1% of those being CEOs. So this is a short story. This is a poor scorecard for a society that prides itself on multiculturalism. They challenge our egalitarian self-image, these numbers, they really do. And they challenge our future prosperity as a nation. If we aren't making the most of our multicultural talents, are we squandering missed opportunities? Some may argue that in time these statistics would change because that was the rite of passage of other migrants. However, the statistics translate to disparities when we realise at the entry level into the workforce we're already seeing some racist barriers. Economists at the University of Sydney found in a recent study involving resumes that those who had an Anglo-Saxon name were 3 times more likely to be invited for an interview compared to a candidate with a Chinese name. But the same study found that if the Chinese person anglicised their first name, it doubled the chances. And for someone with a Middle Eastern name, the same number of interviews for a job applicant with an Anglo-Saxon name was 64% more applications required. If you were Indigenous, 39% more applications required for the same position before an interview was given. To quote Tim, multiculturalism can be as superficial as food and festivals. But if we're serious about diversity, we must be prepared to hold up a mirror to ourselves and ask, if what we see looks right for an egalitarian and multicultural Australia. The Australian Human Rights Commission in 2016 commissioned the Leading for Change Blueprint for Cultural Diversity and Inclusive Leadership. This goes on to list some very specific targets and goals for organisations to embed in making their businesses more relevant. The current prevalence of cultural diversity in positions of leadership reflect impediments to equal opportunity, which indicate that we have a problem of unfulfilled talent. Organisations may not be promoting the best people, opportunities for growth and innovation may be squandered. A study by an economist, Scotty Page, found that a group drawn from a diverse pool of people was superior to a group drawn from talented individual thinkers who are homogenous, because that unique kind of learning that takes place when people from different backgrounds who come together can't be compared. It doesn't happen when within one group of homogenous thinkers the outcome is similar. Experiences with cultural diversity are associated with improved cognitive skill and intellectual confidence. There's mounting evidence to show a diverse workforce makes for better decision making. In another analysis conducted by the McKinsey Institute in the US, a positive relationship was found between diverse leaders and better financial performance. So beyond a moral imperative, there's a proven fiscal imperative as well. There was a study involving 366 companies, and the top quartile of cultural diversity were 35% more likely to have returns above the industry median. Insofar as drawing on practical strategies of what you can do and what can you take back to engage actively working towards inclusion, we can draw on what's called the Workplace Cultural Diversity Tool. It's an online tool, and it assesses workplaces' ability to manage diversity, and there are 30 different measures that can be looked at and possibly contemplated to implement. Some of these include ensuring the policies that are in place support workplace diversity. Are you a multicultural employer? Do you have that clause that you invite people of all backgrounds to apply? Have internal audits to identify systemic discrimination or patterns of behaviour or policies or practices that are part of the structure of an organisation, which might disadvantage or might for minority groups. Employ the practice of having blind CVs so that you don't have the ethnicity or even the gender or even the age of an applicant when they apply to be seen on the CV, just their skill set and their merit. Provide mentors to ensure workers are being supported and guided through the process of growing in an organisation. That said, it's important to also rein in the expectations of culturally diverse employees. There has been also research to show there's a lot of pressure sometimes placed on these migrant employees who, when they land a job, are told or expected to not just maintain the reign of what they do, but also represent all the cultural diversity within an entire organisation, which is not feasible. One friend told me her boss said to her, "You're no fun to have around in the workplace. I can't swear around you or make racist and inoffensive comments. The only reason you're here is because you're so damn good at what you do." This friend went on to say, "I feel the need to be 10 times better than my colleagues just to keep my job. The pressure is phenomenal." So let's think about the kind of pressure that we are subliminally placing on these culturally diverse employees. Consider zero tolerance for any form of bigotry. I know the Commonwealth Bank of Australia multicultural manager, Huss Mustafa, has actually made a comment embedded in the charter with their workplace that goes to every year they do a performance review of their workers, and they have a stipulated comment that is anyone who will refuse to abide the CBA charter of an equal opportunity employer and non-discriminatory practices, anyone who can't abide that has to leave the organisation. So such is his commitment to diversity in the workplace, in inclusion and representation and respect, that if you can't sign up to those values of respect, you're shown the door. Unconscious bias training is important, and cultural competence training. Are there particular key groups in your organisation of different ethnicities that you might actually benefit from an actual one-on-one session on their background, their nuances, their faith beliefs, for example? Depending on where you're working, this can be very practical. Indeed, organisations might need to rethink traditional paradigms of what contemporary leadership looks like. Promoting inclusive leadership avoids privileging prevailing groups that have long occupied these roles because of these assumptions of what leadership is meant to look like and what it's meant to sound like and what it's meant to feel like. It has to change, as we've changed. Bringing it back again to today, I am mindful of this campaign by the Australian Human Rights Commission on racism, it stops with me. Some of you might have seen it. It invites workplaces who are serious about promoting social cohesion to become a signatory. So far, I think over 350 workplaces have signed up nationally. When I first came across this campaign of racism, it stops with me, it was very powerful because it stated that I had the power to do something or do nothing. It made me think about the consequences of my action or inaction could impact another person's life if I chose to stay or turn away. In the current climate of seeing potential, of having the data and the numbers now, and the tools at our disposal, like the online learning tool, the pathway to effect social change, I would posit, if we're employers, is that if we are not consciously inclusive, we become deliberately exclusive. So let's talk about the Multicultural Charter. And where does that sit? Well, I can say at the outset that upon hearing about the Charter for the first time just recently and reading it, in particular its 8 guiding principles, I was genuinely optimistic about the promise this vision holds for a genuinely inclusive and representative society. I'd also be clear that, of my own experience, I'm more than a headscarf. As much as any of my bilingual colleagues in the room here are more than their language set or set of beliefs. Our cultural parameters should not preclude us from overall success and leadership within an organisation, but rather present scope for embracing diversity in all its gendered and cultural breadth. This is not just about kicking goals or representing minorities for a feel-good campaign or a media op. It's an imperative to be undertaken because it is the decent thing to do. It's important also to acknowledge that the resolution to change exceeds the scope of any document, including a charter, unless an organisation administers that vision in tandem with institutional will and action. So to those who are agitating for change, I say make a noise. Disruption matters. Often you need to challenge the status quo. In actioning the Charter, it is vital that the involvement of the multicultural communities in your society are involved at the very, very, very basic inception of ideas to the execution of them. There's this other expression of nothing about us without us. You can't actively represent a minority community without their buy-in, without their feedback. If you want things to be sustainable and meaningful, it's something that's very, very obvious, yet a practice that's so far too often replicated again and again. Just to end with, I wanted to share another anecdote. In contrary to my Ewan story, about a year ago, I was presenting at a writers' festival, and at the end of the festival, it was to primary school students, and this young boy, who was about year 7, I was about 10 years old, 11 years old, he approached me, at 12. He approached me at the end of it after the signing, and I could see he had something to say, and he was shuffling, and I was having a little Ewan moment, thinking, what does he want? But I sort of very gingerly said to him, excuse me, are you okay? And he said, excuse me, miss. And he had his name tag on, it said Zach. So his name was Zach, and he was from one of these inner city alternative schools in Melbourne. And he said, ma'am, I just wanted to tell you that I think intersectionality, I'm a feminist, and he had my complete attention at this point. And I just want to tell you that I think intersectionality of race and gender are really big issues, and I just wanted to know, what are your views? It was 12. And I just went, oh, well, I think the fact that you were having this conversation now is very encouraging. And then I juxtaposed that moment with my Ewan moment and thought, in many ways, I hope we really have progressed to a point where we acknowledge and embrace the breadth of diversity around us and see the positive in it and discuss it. And what we don't know, we ask. And rather than use the word tolerate difference, which I think is horrible, we tolerate bad sports scores. We tolerate bad weather, but we shouldn't tolerate each other. We should learn to understand. We may not agree, but we should respectfully understand the differences that we have, and I think that is absolutely essential. But I do want to thank Zach for giving me hope, and Ewan, because he put me on the path of breaking down obstacles and twirling down through barriers. And as I wrote here, both the boys showed me that the road to change is paved with diversity and inclusion. So thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you, Tasneem. Laid out the case for diversity and inclusion and resolving unconscious bias so eloquently, so clearly. We've got time for questions. I'd like to open it up to the floor. As I do so, we've got some microphones going around the room. Can you just put your hand up and wait till the microphone comes to you before you stand up and ask your question? For a couple of reasons, so everyone can hear you and also so that we can capture you on camera. We'd love to capture you on camera. That might shorten the number of questions. But whilst so feel free to put your hand up. I might just ask the first question to get us going. I guess, Tasneem, I was conscious, as I said, you laid out the argument fairly clearly, very clearly, coherently, logical, common sense, and I'm mindful that things that are common sense and obvious are not always easy. There's a lot of Ewans still in Australia, a lot of Ewans about, and yes, I did think about that. It takes a position of leading with courage to tackle the Ewans. Where do you begin when leading with courage?
Okay. Where do I?
It will turn on.
Where do I begin? That's like a song, isn't it? I know I'm not doing it alone. The fact that I, have a broad network of colleagues and friends who are in a similar space of doing advocacy work for diversity and inclusion means I'm not battling the Ewan monster on my own. And I think that's very encouraging. The fact that you have events like this, charters like the Multicultural Charter, and the principles that inform that charter means the impact of the Ewans is significantly reduced. And I think Ewan represents the vocal minority that owns a large proportion of the media, admittedly, and gets a lot of airtime and gets paid for that airtime, but in fact doesn't actually speak to the voice of the majority of the public that I deal with. And I think that's encouraging. And I've also, in my experience found that if I had to map or draw a graph of the kind of audiences that I engage with, if you can imagine it as this bar, at one end I have the Ewans of the world, and on the other end I have these extremely conservative migrant communities who fail to integrate or don't want to integrate, who feel completely victimised and who have a very anti-world view. But between that, there's a 90% bar of what I call maybe the Middle Australia voice, who do engage. And so I really put my efforts in those because I know at the polar ends of each of that bar, they're not going to change. So I fight the battles that I know are winnable, and I don't expect to win all the battles. But I'm also realistic about what I can change and what I can't. So I don't have no illusions about either end of that pole, but I'm quite happy to be in the middle, if that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you. Time for some questions. We have a lady in the middle here.
Thank you. So diversity and inclusion has been a global topic in organisations for a long time, and yet we've only seen very small incremental improvements in the majority of companies. Do you have any case studies or examples where you have seen transformational changes in organisations to show diversity and inclusion?
In Australia, the research is really scarce. I mean, probably Diversity Council could speak to that more, and one of our panellists is from there. She could probably give more detail. But we are still much newer at it than our European, Canadian or American counterparts. So, for example, the McKinsey Research Institute has got really detailed examples. They name the large corporations who've actually embedded the value of cultural diversity in leadership particularly, and how that, yes, increases not just the moral imperative, but the fiscal imperative of organisations. So that the data is there, the stats are there, we're just catching on. I know the ANZ has been very active in probably championing this probably before most of the corporates. I was quite familiar with their programs up to even 5-6 years ago, but now I'm seeing it with law firms. I'm seeing it with media institutions, the boards that I'm on. They're all standing up to take notice that, oh, hang on, everyone at this table in a boardroom doesn't look like our client base. You know, we're not getting those clients attending. We're not getting that buy-in from that particular group. So people are realising that, and it's really helped when we do things like assess census data or assess diversity council reports to see that diversity is very much a part of who we are, and unless we can actually keep up with those changes and reflect them in our program planning, we'll lose out. We keep doing the same thing again and again and wonder why our numbers aren't going up, our profits aren't going up, people are turning away. What are we doing wrong? So it's in programming, it's in evaluation, it's in all of those issues about taking a really good hard look and lens. And in terms of, do we have those examples? Not yet, to my knowledge, not anywhere to the breadth that I'd like, but at least we're having the conversation.
So Tasneem, it sounds like there's some good opportunities for people in the audience who are involved in this space to be working with some of those corporates in Australia to change those stories and tell those stories. Any other questions? Nora?
Thanks, Tasneem. I came across an article in the Harvard Business Review a number of years ago, and it troubles me even till this day because I, like you, am involved in diversity training. And what the article stated was across a number of years, and I think they charted 30 years of data sets when it comes to diversity training itself within organizations, that diversity training doesn't actually work. And especially when it comes to, I guess, intention of diversity training, whether it's to avoid lawsuits, so whether it's, sexual harassment, or to ensure that, people don't talk about, things they shouldn't be talking about, or racist jokes and things like that, because it labels those employees as being racist or sexist, etc. So it actually doesn't change behavior. Can you comment on that? Because and you mentioned about diversity training itself and especially unconscious bias, and yet the data sets tell us that it doesn't actually work. So then what works?
I recall that article too. And I recall it was controversial for the fact that while it was positing diversity training wasn't working, it wasn't offering an alternative. So it was the status quo that's not the solution either. And I think there was some counter arguments made to that. Well, it depends on the way in which you do that. You may not do diversity training per se, but you start implementing other tools like the blind CVs, mentoring in an organisation, aligning yourself with partnered organisations which will have a stream of young kids from, say, a migrant community background that you start mentoring, like the Lifesavers. The Lifesaver is in Victoria, the Surf Lifesavers Club, for example. They've been running a program where they basically mentor young refugee kids on safe swimming and practices and how to become a lifesaver, and then they basically mentor them up to the point where they can become lifesavers themselves, and they go on to do that. So it's not about training the organisation per se, but adopting a program that actually targets minority communities to get them involved in the actual organisation. So there's the optics of it as well, that you can be creative in how you embed diversity without naming it. But I think my personal belief is if you don't name diversity and you don't name inclusion, that's actually part of the problem. And I've had this conversation, I think, even recently, where I was giving a leadership training to women's organisation, and I mentioned that the trial of women of colour in the battle of discrimination, and this woman in the audience, she got very upset, and she goes, "Why do you keep mentioning colour? Why can't you just say diversity?" And I said, "Well, I do say diversity, but I also mention colour because specifically the discriminatory realities of people of colour can't be silenced, and by trying to erase that experience, you're reinforcing the need to mention it. And so by the same token, by not mentioning diversity and not mentioning the R word, you're actually, as part of the problem. People need to be uncomfortable about change because it's not easy. But ultimately, it's the right thing to do when you have an organisation that's respectful and inclusive. That's my belief.